Yes, well, in the biological world, we have lots and lots of these examples of forward planning and backup systems. There are so many. So here are a few quirky ones uh, from the fact file. This is a report we wrote about a while ago relating to this little plant that's a very low growing plant with very short lived flowers. They don't flower for very long, and it rejoices in this wonderful name, evolvulus, sometimes volvulus, depending on where you come from. And it has a bit of a problem with rain because the flowers do not last very long, and flowers exist to be pollinated. Now, this flower is pollinated by bees, but bees tend not to fly during the rainy season, on rainy days. And these flowers don't last very long, they last less than a day. So, what happens when it rains? Well, they don't get pollinated. But in fact, they do get pollinated. So, what's the solution to the rain problem for this weird little short lived, low growing flowers? It's actually a creature that you wouldn't think of. It's a snail. Um, these flowers open in the morning, they last for about half a day. In dry weather, they're pollinated by bees. But in rainy weathers, it turns out that snails can actually carry their pollen when the bees are not active. Uh, so, who ever thought that snails could have a good function? I normally do not like snails going around my flowers because they tend to eat them up. So, I shall still remove the snails from my petunias. Snails love petunias. But for this little plant, the snails are not an enemy. So there you are. Snails do have some good function. After all, the Lord said that when he finished the world, everything was very good. Even snails were very good. Uh, but there was an interesting comment in the source that we had for this story from one of our scientific sources, which is a blog about botany called Botany One. And the author who wrote the article about this particular plant said continuity of pollination, in other words, being able to be pollinated by two different things when one is absent. Continuity of pollination, regardless of the weather, that's a smart move on the plant's part. Now, hang on, who's being smart here? Do you think the plant thought that up? Do you think the snail did? No, someone outside this whole system designed the plant, designed the snail, and it works. Now, here's another example from out in the real world. Um, do you like to go walking in the forest during the autumn and you have all of these fallen leaves? I grew up in a temperate climate. I still live in a temperate climate. We do have temperate climate areas in Australia, and you can go walking in the forest of deciduous trees and you can scrunch your way through the autumn leaves. I really like that. But of course, the autumn leaves are not just there for us to play with. The autumn leaves need to be recycled, otherwise they will just build up and they'll sit there on the ground. So what is it that recycles the autumn leaves? Well, certain fungi and various little invertebrates will do that, but the most important contributor to recycling the autumn leaves back into the soil, they make recycling of nutrients, are these creatures, and we'll talk a little bit more about these later on. Worms. Now, earthworms will chew up fallen leaves, fallen leaf litter, fallen organic matter wonderfully well and recycle the nutrients into the soil so that the trees and the plants can continue to grow. However, there is a bit of a problem with autumn leaves. They contain substances called polyphenols, and these can interfere with the digestive enzymes. So it's very hard for this leaf matter to be digested when you have high amounts of these polyphenols, which are quite concentrated in the autumn leaves. However, the worms have a unique solution to that. They have unique chemicals which are not found in other creatures called drylodefensins. They're a sort of organic molecule which counteract the effects of the polyphenols on the digestive system. So the earthworms can munch their way through autumn leaves and their digestion remains intact. Now, this is important as one of the science sources that we got this from. Without drylodefensins, fallen leaves would remain on the surface of the ground for a very long time, building up into a thick layer. Our countryside would be unrecognizable, right? We'd be buried in piles of autumn leaves, and the whole system of carbon cycling would be disrupted. So we need to think of design in biology beyond the individual creatures and look at the whole ecosystems of how things interact with one another. That's one of the things we're particularly interested in creation research. Not only individual design within individual living organisms, that's fascinating enough, but then you've also got the interaction between completely different organisms which have no relationship to one another that can be put into any evolutionary tree. No, this is a system that's been built by someone outside. And as usual, the evolutionists insist this is an example of adaptation. We have identified the key mechanism for adaptation to a dietary challenge in an animal group that has a major role in organic matter recycling in soils worldwide. No, this is not adaptation, this is design. After all, how many worms would, without these drylodefensins, would die of polyphenols interfering with their digestive system if they didn't already had it? There had to be forward planning in this. So this is not adaptation. Adaptation is a real process. It is the ability to cope with changes in the environment, but it will not produce a substance that the worm did not already have. For that, you need the genetics which control the biochemical pathway in order to make them. So worms plus autumn leaves is actually a design system made by an intelligent designer, an intelligent creator outside the entire system who made the trees and the leaves and the worms. So let's just move away from the land and go into the sea. Now, John, I know that you like to go fishing. Do you ever find any starfish on the rocks? Have you ever trodden on any and you get
I've even caught them
squirting
on
out?
the end of my fishing line as they try to pull off a bit of crab or something like that. So, yes, I've seen them on the ground. I've trod on them. I've seen them ripped up by angry fishermen because they're raiding crab nets and that, but they just remultiply from a portion. So there's lots of them around here.
Yes, there's plenty of them. Now, when they're stranded on the rocks like that during low tide, if you stand on one, you sometimes get sort of water squirting out of them. Have you ever noticed that?
Yeah, certainly have.
Yes. Well, it's interesting that starfish live in the sea, of course, under the water. And when they are underwater, they move about on little tube feet. They're tiny little tube feet. And they don't work like muscular feet in other sorts of creatures. So when they're underwater, they're quite mobile, but we normally only see them when they're still. However, there is a problem if they live in the intertidal zone. What happens when the tide goes out? Well, they can get stranded high and dry, and they can't move because of the way their feet work. That they can't move, and so if they're stranded on rocks or sand like that during the period between tides, they are in danger of overheating. Now it's very interesting if that happens. If they do get overheated, but not so much that they don't die, that they survive until the tide comes back in, they actually have a memory of that, And they have a way of saying, all right, well, next time the tide comes in, I can cope with this. They literally keep their cool. So the next time the tide comes in, the starfish will absorb extra water. And what they're doing here is making use of what's called thermal inertia. It takes a lot of heat to raise the temperature of water. And so by absorbing extra water, they are able to cope with the heat the next time the tide goes out, and that prevents them from overheating. So what we've got here is a brilliant case of thermoregulation, or regulation of heat control. Now you think about that. That can only work if there's some sort of sensing mechanism. In other words, they can measure the temperature in between the tide when they got overheated. And there is also a preset system for coping with that increase. So the starfish recognizes, yes, the temperature has gone up. I have to actually cope with this. So next time the tide comes in, it will absorb more water and make use of the thermal inertia. So who taught starfish thermoregulation? Again, it's not the starfish being smart any more than it's that little convolvulus plant being smart. It's someone outside the system who designed things to work well, both within themselves, right, in their own internal working, and the way that they work with other creatures and with the environment in general.